Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Susan Hudson from Texas Fertility Center with another episode of Fertility Docs Uncensored. I am here with my fantabulous co-host, Dr. Carrie Bedient from Fertility Center of Las Vegas,
Hi.
and Dr. Abby Eblen from Nashville Fertility Center.
Hey, everybody.
How are y'all doing?
Great. What are you guys up to this weekend?
So I got to see Nate Bargatze last night. It was so
Oh,
fun.
oh,
So
he's
how
the
big of
how big of a venue was that? Was it big
it
or little?
it was at the Majestic Theater in San Antonio, and that's where we have like all of our Broadway productions come into
Oh,
town.
okay.
Like
So pretty big.
it was a big venue. It was fun. It was fun. I saw him, and then like about I guess it was about a month ago, saw Jim Gaffigan. He came to San Antonio.
Hmm.
And I love the deadpan humor, and it's just so serious and sarcastic, but it's funny and not
Hmm.
not usually too offensive.
Yeah.
I mean, both of those guys are known for working clean, which is
Mhm.
in comedy, like they're always the best comedians because
Yeah.
they don't do any cheap jokes.
You don't
They're
have to you don't
all
have to go that low to be funny.
no.
Yeah, Jim Gaffigan just has a lot of family humor that I think people can relate to too. I think
Mhm.
he's hilarious. I really like him a lot.
When he came, it was during spring break, and his son, who is like 15, 16, was actually touring with him during spring break and came and did as he was one of the opening acts. And it was funny. It was funny. Yeah.
So was his son actually good?
He was reasonably good for a 15, 16-year-old. I mean, it
You
was
know,
anybody who can sit there and everybody's like, oh, you're sick, because like Jim Gaffigan has like I think five children,
four or five, yeah, a
4 or 5
bunch.
kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, everybody's like, oh, you're so lucky. And he's like, yeah, I'm the one who lost. He got the
Now
short
that
end of the stick. He goes,
now
really?
that I
Tour- Touring with 3 50-year-old men? That's oh so fun.
I don't remember a lot about Jim Gaffigan, but his son was with him. I remember that now that he let his son do like a couple of like one comedian came out and then his son, I think, came out next because you're like,
Yeah.
wow, this is a really young comedian. And then he said who he was. So it was kind of cool. Yeah, kind of neat. Very
That's
cool.
What other comedians do you like?
We saw when we were in Cleveland, we saw Norm Macdonald from Saturday Night Live,
Mm.
and we had such high hopes. And I'm pretty sure he was completely obliterated during the entirety of his set.
Really?
And was not super impressed. We saw Dave Chappelle when he came into town, and his act was solid. It was, I mean, when you listen to some of his recorded shows, they're just on point, and the live show was a little different. Probably the most notable thing that happened was there was a heckler halfway through who decided to go after him. And of all places to be a heckler, like Las Vegas, come on, their security is top notch 100% of the time. Dave Chappelle's a veteran. He's not going to tolerate any of that nonsense. And so it was really an interesting choice that guy made to heckle one of the best known comedians in one of the entertainment cities out there. So it's like, oh, that was a choice. Trying to think, there was
Another
somebody
good
else
one.
that I saw who was really good. I saw Jeff Dunham at some point, with all
My
of
husband loves Jeff Dunham.
his puppets. So
So I've seen Jerry Seinfeld a long time ago, and he was really good. I can't remember anything that he did, but he was really good. And then we saw John Mulaney probably a year or so ago. He was a
mhm.
writer for Saturday Night Live, and
Oh
he's
yeah.
like his partner is Olivia Munn or whatever. But he's really funny. He can make things that are not funny really, really funny. And one of the funniest things, and actually it was not when he did this in the show, but if you look it up on YouTube, one of the offices that we have is in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and it's spelled really weird. It's Murfreesboro. And they said, what was the worst show you ever did? And it's like this YouTube clip, and he's like, well, I went to this town called Murfreesboro. And it is really hard to pronounce. He goes, I think it was some general that was like chewing his grits and he couldn't talk, and they wrote the name out. And so anyway, it's just kind of funny. So, but he's a really funny guy.
My roommate from college, her son does the best impersonation of him. I'm telling you, it's like right on. So, all right. Well, let's go on to our questions of the day. All right. So our first one is I'm a big fan of your show. Thank you for helping women like myself understand our fertility. I'm 28, husband is 40, been trying to conceive with 4 cycles, but no luck. Have a regular 25 to 26 day cycle with 10 to 11 day luteal phase using OPKs and spotting for about 2 days prior to my full bleed. I know luteal phase deficiency is very debated, and there isn't conclusive information linking luteal phase deficiency to fertility, infertility, time to conception. Is my shorter luteal phase a normal variation, or is this pattern a problem? Not sure if the 12-month wait prior to fertility testing is based on mine or my husband's age. Thank you for all you do.
She's right. I mean, luteal phase defect is debated, but I think, if you're at all worried about it, it's a real easy fix. And I have no problem giving people extra progesterone because if you have
Mhm.
spotting a few days before your period, it suggests that your progesterone level is dropping down a little bit too low. And so, it's one of those things where whether it really exists or not, doesn't really matter. If your progesterone level's low and you're worried about it, kind of like baby aspirin, why not take it? It probably doesn't hurt anything and it probably helps, just to kind of extend your cycle. And the idea is if your luteal phase is short, that the pregnancy, just when it starts to get implanted, if you have a period, it may result in loss of the pregnancy. So that's would be the reason to treat it. So I usually treat it if I'm worried about it.
I think that the science behind it of supplementing with progesterone, rock solid. The theory is great. I find that patients get frustrated because they end up using it in a way unintentionally that functions as birth control, at worst, or at best, it throws off what is otherwise a really regular cycle, even if there is spotting ahead of time, because they will be on the progesterone and then they won't get their cycle, and then they'll get frustrated because they'll think that they're pregnant, but they're not because they're on the progesterone. And so the
Yeah.
first couple of cycles seem to always go fine, but once you do it for a long time, I find people get really frustrated because their cycle's not coming, which it's not supposed to while you're on the progesterone, but it ends up being kind of a pain in the neck. So I don't have any objection to doing it. I just very clearly warn people ahead of time, like, look, the theory behind this is rock solid. The execution is not always as user friendly as all of us would like it to be.
So I would like to comment that I kind of think of luteal phase deficiency as a chicken or the egg phenomenon. Is it really
Uh-huh.
luteal phase is reflecting something in your follicular phase? So anybody who thinks they might have a luteal phase issue, I think that in itself is enough reason to go see a reproductive endocrinologist because we need to make sure, is there an egg issue? Because I mean, I can tell you all three of us have definitely
Yeah.
diagnosed egg issues based on luteal phase deficiency histories. Make sure your thyroid's working appropriately, make sure your prolactin's working appropriately, and those types of things, and kind of make sure that you're not missing anything. And the second part of your question is, is the time to conceive 12-month wait mainly based on your age or your partner's age? Well, technically it's based on your age, but because you're having this issue, I would go ahead and recommend going and seeing somebody. But if we were not dealing with any issues and you were just trying to conceive, at that point, I think, waiting, 6 months to a year is a reasonable thing. But anybody who has an inkling that there may be a problem, go get it checked out because I find people are very actually intuitive as to that there might be a problem.
Hmm. Yeah. And we don't want you waiting a ton of extra time when there's a known issue that we could already be starting to tackle.
Yeah. Okay, let's do one more question. I'm single and 34. I currently don't have a partner, would like to use IUI to try for a baby. What are my first steps? My insurance will not cover IUI unless I can prove to them I'm infertile and that 3 attempts have failed. Ideally, I don't want there to be anything wrong with me, but I'm struggling on how to afford 3 rounds of IUI with donor sperm. Do you have any suggestions for affording this?
That's a tough one. Because really
That
it's more a cost issue than it is an IUI issue, and it's expensive. I think, it's kind of the same issue with people who want to do advanced reproductive technologies regardless. It's just unfortunately, if your insurance doesn't cover it, it's either live with those standards or when November comes around, if you can, even if it's a higher insurance that you have to pay for, a more expensive insurance you have to pay for, maybe you do that to have coverage for it.
Always make sure if you're going to do that, always read the fine print, because the brokers are not necessarily good about explaining what your benefits are for that. And there's a ton of fine print in there. You know, for example, somebody who says, oh yeah, you have a IVF coverage, but if it's from a vasectomy or tying your tubes, oh, sorry, we're not going to cover that. Like the
Yeah.
fine print's really important
Or
in
if you're
that.
single, a single female, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer for that other than because I don't want to suggest any of the things that I have seen people do, which is Craigslist sperm donors.
Yeah.
And like
No.
Craigslist is rarely the right answer for any question.
But
Uh,
I would have to say that I think that I would make sure you know what you're dealing with. Okay. And what I mean by that is, I mean, if you're having regular menstrual periods, you're 34 years old, you know, go to your OB-GYN, have them do an HSG, have them do an AMH and FSH and estradiol level. Kind of make sure that kind of your general biology is working on the surface.
mhm.
And then if everything from that standpoint looks good, then call your local reproductive endocrinology office, say, hey, listen, at the very basics, what if I'm a single female looking to do donor sperm IUI, how much are your services going to cost? So you really know what you're comparing to and not being in this world of, oh, I think it costs this. Like actually get real numbers. And then, of course, you can contact some of the commercial sperm banks to find out how much sperm actually costs. So you really know what's going on. I mean, yes, it's probably going to cost you, including sperm, a few $1,000s for a try. But if everything's working right, ideally it's going to happen in the first 3 cycles, and hopefully with minimal intervention, adding additional cost. So just make sure you know what your numbers are that you're actually talking about.
Make sure you're asking those questions of the financial office. The front desk ladies and the doctors are not the right ones to answer those questions.
Don't ask the doctors.
Don't ask the doctors. We never have the right answer. Like my billing office will actively yell at us if we give out any financial information, because invariably we get something wrong and then the patient gets really mad at them for the wrong information we gave. Oh, it's a bad scene. Because good financial people are hard to find, and when you find them, you keep them forever. The other thing to consider is that I remember with some of the sperm banks, they'll have like sperms on special, or sperm vials on special, and it's
I didn't
not,
know that. Sperm
I've
on
seen it. I
special sperm.
remember Seattle was the one that I remember talking to.
No
And it's just
kidding.
because they would have a guy that they're like, this guy is great. For some reason, he's not getting picked. Let's put him on special, because I mean, they all know the sperm donors, and so they know who they like.
Yeah.
And so if they see someone who's like, this really should be going, he seems like a really good person, they'll do that. And so I've seen that in the past. I haven't looked for it recently, but it's not anything bad about the sperm. It's not like it's just about to expire or anything. So that's
Episode number 200 was Seattle Sperm Bank, right? I'm plugging our episode 200 where we talked to people from Seattle Sperm Bank.
Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, let's move on for our topic of the day. So today we're going to talk a little bit about 3 little letters, PGT. All right. And we're not going to get into the depths of the minutia of the science, but we really want to provide a good overview so that our listeners can kind of understand what is available in the PGT world and what is going to apply mostly to you. So let's start off with the simple stuff. What does PGT stand for?
Pre-implantation genetic testing. And that's changed a little bit, because if you know somebody that went through IVF maybe 5 years ago, it was PGT.
It's PGS.
It was PGS. And then before that, it was CCS.
CCS, from complete chromosome sequencing. Yeah.
I remember so our national society is ASRM, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. And I remember going to one meeting and all of a sudden everybody was like, PGT, PGT, PGT. And I'm like, well, apparently.
What does that mean?
Today.
Yeah.
I'm really glad they standardized it. I am so glad they standardized it, because there was a long time, because a lot of these changes happened right as I was a resident fellow. And so I hadn't been in the world long enough to really know what they all meant. And so I was forever confused about, well, what the hell is CCS versus PGS versus PGD, or all of those things. So now they've at least standardized it. So I just need to know PGT, and then the alphabet soup that follows it of A, S, R, M, P.
So before we get into all those other letters, when we say pre-implantation genetic testing, can we break that down a little bit to explain to our listeners what are we doing with this?
So pre-implantation genetic testing is exactly what it sounds like, where it's testing that you do once you have an embryo, but before it has been transferred back to the uterus. And so this is something that only applies to IVF. You cannot do this with IUI or, ovulation induction Clomid cycles. You have to have the embryo. And the only way that we have access to that is by doing IVF, because that's where we have the egg and the sperm and the resulting embryo in the lab, where we can actually get information and do things. And what it's talking about is testing that you do on that embryo before it ever gets transferred.
And I'd like just to add to that, I was going to say, a lot of people will say when they want to freeze eggs, they're like, well, can you test the chromosomes of the egg? And so to Carrie's point, she just said this, you can't just test the egg or the sperm. You have to put the two of them together. And it's only when you put the two of them together that you can do genetic testing and really know what the chromosome number is on the embryo.
An egg is one cell, a sperm is one cell. You could theoretically test each of those one cells, but the testing would destroy them. And so it's not functional. So you have to let the two come together, and the resulting embryo is going to have, 150 to 300 cells, more or less. And so you can take a handful of those cells, and it's not going to harm the embryo. And so you can get the information without destroying it, which is the main problem when you're getting eggs or sperm alone.
Well, really not a handful of cells though, Carrie, right?
You are not taking a handful of cells, because the embryo itself is so itty bitty teeny.
Not even a handful.
Yeah.
So talking about taking cells, at what stage do we do this testing, and about how many cells do we take and from what?
So we do this usually on the fifth day of development. So we hope by the fifth day, the egg and sperm have gone together, fertilization has occurred, the embryos continue to grow in the lab. And for most of our labs, we'll look at embryos at the one cell stage. So 24 hours after the egg retrieval or 18 hours after fertilization, we'll look to see if it is truly fertilized. So there's certain things that the lab look at to say, yes, this is a one cell embryo, male and female chromosomes have joined together. Then we put our little embryos back in the incubator, kind of like putting a plant under grow lights. We just let it grow and do its thing. On the fifth day, most labs then take the embryo out. And we hope at that stage that the embryo, like Carrie says, has 140 to 300 cells or whatever. And so at that stage, the embryo has differentiated into what will be the future baby, called the inner cell mass, and what will be the future placenta. And so ultimately, most embryology labs will take about 6 cells, give or take a little bit, from what will be the future placenta. So it's like doing a really, really early placental biopsy. We don't take the cells that we know are going to be the embryo for obvious reasons. And ultimately, we send those off and evaluate those to see the number of chromosomes the embryo actually has.
So when we're doing this biopsy, so we can do it on days 5, 6, or 7. Back a long time ago, we did this through a different technology on day 3. Like, I don't think anybody does that anymore. At least
probably somebody does.
There's somebody who's doing it, but if they're biopsying your embryos on day 3, I might suggest looking elsewhere.
Yes.
When people talk about the damage done or potential for damage, the day 3 is definitively not good for the embryo and your success rates resulting from them. It's not as though, by doing the biopsy on day 3 that you're going to have a child that's born without an arm or without a foot or things like that. It does not work that way.
Yeah.
But success rates are much lower with day 3 biopsies, and nobody does.
That was the state of the art about 20 years ago. That's what we did 20 years ago.
So talking about safety, how safe is it to biopsy the embryo?
I mean, we think it's pretty safe. We do it all the time. And so generally, when we biopsy cells, at that point, the embryo has differentiated into what will be future baby, what will be future placenta. And so we take cells from what will be the future placenta. Now, the tricky part about the biopsy is, you would think it's pretty black and white, like it's a normal embryo or it's not. But the tricky part is when you do a biopsy in the placenta, ultimately you get cells from the placenta. And most of the time, about 98 to 99% of the time, the cells in the placenta have the same chromosomal makeup of the cells that will form the future baby. But about 1 to 2% of the time, they don't. And so that's a type of mosaic embryo, meaning the cells in the embryo are not all the same. And so it's possible that when we do this biopsy, it's possible that we may get cells from the placenta that don't reflect what the genetics of the embryo will be. But about 98 to 99% of the time, if we tell a patient we're transferring a genetically normal embryo, we're correct, because 98 to 99% of the time, this biopsy reflects what is in the embryo genetically.
We're gonna get to kind of genetically normal. We're gonna talk about that term a little bit later. Because sometimes we want to say we're chromosomally normal versus we're testing specific things, but we're going to get into a little bit of the alphabet soup of PGT at this moment. So we're going to start off with PGTA. Okay, PGTA is the type of PGT that is most commonly going to be used in the IVF population. So let's talk a little bit about the A.
So A stands for aneuploidy, which is referring to the total number of chromosomes present. So to kind of make sure that we're all speaking the same language here, chromosomes are the individual packages of genetic material that are within each cell. And theoretically, the chromosomes within your entire body in every single cell are identical to each other. And you should have 46 of them. It's 23 pairs. So one came from whoever gave the sperm that made you, the other came from whoever gave the egg that made you, and then they duplicated and replicated. And so each cell in your body accesses a little bit different, grouping of the information packets that are within those chromosomes to get your eyes, your heart, your toenail, whatever. And so when we are looking at PGTA, we are looking at the presence or absence of those chromosomes, and we're looking at whole chromosomes. And so the way that I describe PGTA to my patients is that imagine you're standing 2 blocks away from me, and I'm jumping up and down 2 blocks away and waving my arms and wiggling my legs and all of those things. And so we can
all see this happening, okay? So
I'm like, I can't wait to hear this analogy,
watching
Carrie.
us on YouTube, like the faces of me and Abby, we're just visualizing it, because it would not be a far off thing from Carrie jumping up and down and waving her arms and legs, getting our attention.
Yeah, you have such great analogies, Carrie. I'm waiting to hear what this is, because I know I'm going to use it with my patients. So go right ahead, keep going.
So with PGTA, if you're standing 2 blocks away from me, you can see that I'm jumping up and down, flailing my arms and legs. You can see that I've got 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 feet, torso, head, all, like you can see the big parts. You cannot see that I have a giant zit in the middle of my chin. And so what you can see from a distance is the big stuff's there. You cannot tell whether I'm cute or not. You cannot tell whether I have acne that day. You cannot tell
cute,
whether
though.
I have...
Carrie's really cute. She's very cute.
But you can't tell whether I've got a cancerous mole on my, on my elbow. So you can see the big things. Like if I had an extra arm, you'd be able to see that. If I was missing a leg, you'd be able to see that. But you can't see the fine details.
Very good.
That's a great analogy.
That is a fantastic analogy. So we're doing this testing because when we're rolling that chromosome lottery and we're creating embryos from eggs and sperm, what percentage of the embryos do we expect to be abnormal if you're less than 35?
So if you're less than 35, it's about a 50-50 split, which when I tell my, 25-year-old patients that they have a 50% chance probably of having a genetically normal embryo, they look at me like I've got 3 heads and 5 arms or something, because it just doesn't make sense. But that's just the way nature is. That's why human reproduction is so inefficient, because primarily the eggs that women make, and we'll talk about this in a minute, I'm sure, just don't divide correctly when it's time for ovulation. And so about half the ovulations in a woman under 35 results in a genetically abnormal egg.
thus a genetically abnormal embryo.
Correct.
So what happens over the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to rates of aneuploidy or abnormal number of chromosomes in embryos?
Bad things.
It's not good.
Is the succinct description. The more technical description is rates of aneuploidy exponentially increase over the next 10 years or so. If you go from 35 to 45, at 35, you're looking at like, roughly 60-40, normal to abnormal, 50-50, right in that range. By the time you hit 45, you're looking at 95+% abnormal. And so it increases very sharply because the cells that have to divide, so the chromosomes that have to split up within that egg cell, there is nobody putting WD-40 on those hinges. And so they need to cleanly separate, but they're rusty and they stick together in weird ways. And so they separate out in a way that they're not supposed to, because that egg has been in there in a 40-year-old for 41 years. It was there before she was born and popped out into the world. And so unfortunately, with no maintenance, the longer they have been sitting there, the more things are likely to go boing, and not work the way that they're supposed to.
Good deal. So the idea is that we know that if you did not do this testing, what would happen? Because I mean, there are still lots of people who do not choose to do PGT testing. If you chose not to do testing and you were rolling the genetic lottery when it came to these embryos, what happens when they're put inside a uterus?
So, we'll just assume if you're under 35, say you have, I don't know, 5 or 6 embryos that look really great that make it to the stage of blastocyst. What that means, say you had 6 embryos, that means 3 of those would not have the right chromosome number and 3 would. And so in that patient, we generally only transfer 1 embryo at a time. So in theory, what that really means is we could do 3 and maybe get to the 4th embryo transfer before you ever actually have a healthy pregnancy. Also, if we transfer those embryos and say we happen to hit all 3 in a row that are genetically abnormal, then you could not only not get pregnant, you could also get pregnant, have a miscarriage, have to have surgery for that, go through that process emotionally and physically. So it really takes up a lot of time. And so if time is the issue, then the quicker you can get to the embryo that's the normal one, quicker you can find out about that embryo, the quicker you can get pregnant potentially.
Is it possible that any of these abnormal embryos could result in a baby?
Absolutely. That's
Does-
where Down syndrome comes from. Downs is an extra chromosome at the 21 spot. There's Edwards, there's Patau's, that's chromosomes at the 18 spot and the 13 spot. There's Turner syndrome, which is a missing X. There's a whole list of chromosomes that can be survivable, because most of the time, a wrong chromosome number is not survivable. I mean, missing chromosomes in particular, the body does not tolerate well. Pregnancy is risky for the being carrying the pregnancy, that mom. And so when there is an abnormal embryo, both the body and the embryo have a very vested interest in this is not going to continue. And so most of the time it will not. But there are certain cases, Downs is the most well-known of them, where there's just enough right going on that you can have a live birth from that. But there are implications for that. So there's developmental implications with intellectual ability. There's quite a few physical problems with the gut, with the heart especially, that really make these babies very medically complex at times. And so you can have live births from them. It's not necessarily the experience that everybody anticipates when they think I'm going to have a baby.
And they may not survive very long either. They may pass away at a really early age.
Yeah.
So when we transfer what we think is a chromosomally normal embryo, okay, does that prevent other birth defects?
No,
No.
there are things that don't exist in the embryo. So for example, you can identify if there's an extra or a missing chromosome. You can't identify a heart defect because there's not a heart in the embryo. Like it's not made yet, it doesn't exist yet. The coding is there, but just because the coding is present, it doesn't mean A, that we know what it should be, B, that it's gonna follow all of the A to Z instructions the way that it should. And so there are things that just cannot be picked up at that stage because they just don't exist yet.
Yeah, it's just the process of actually the development of the baby where the process doesn't work well, and therefore they have a malformation of some sort. So not everything is genetic that causes a malformation in a child.
Another question I know we all get from our patients, does this prevent autism?
No. So we can only look at things that have a gene, an actual code for that that gene, that abnormality or normality of the gene or whatever. Autism right now, no one has truly identified a specific gene. There's a group of genes that people look at, but there's no one specific gene for autism. If there was, in theory, we could develop a probe and make a probe for that. But right now, we can't do that.
So I'm going to take that and kind of segue into our next section. So if we know somebody has an abnormal gene or a couple has abnormal genes, first of all, let's talk about what genes are. And then after that, what type of PGT can we do to help deal with a gene issue? Because genes are different than chromosomes.
So genes are little sub packets of information within the chromosome. So if you figure your chromosome is, if your whole genetic code's a book, each chromosome is a chapter, each gene is a page within that chapter. And so if you're missing the whole book, then the situation doesn't work. If you're missing a whole chapter, situation doesn't work. If you are missing a page, sometimes you can still get by and things can be okay. That doesn't mean the book's going to make sense all the time. Like there are going to be storylines that are completely fine, normal, and you're going to understand it all. But there's going to be a storyline where you missed that the gradient tilde killed the killed the gardener in the woodshed with a candlestick, like whatever. And so there are going to be things that do not make sense at all. And so when you're looking at individual genes, in order to know what you're missing, you have to know what you're looking for. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you can't spot it. Like if you don't know that there's a pink needle in the haystack, you're never going to find the pink needle in the haystack because you don't know what you're looking for. And so it ends up being a much more precise set of information that you are looking for. So in order to find it, you have to know what you're looking for ahead of time.
So this type of PGT is called PGT
M.
Okay. And
Monogenic.
Single mutation is where the M comes from.
Single abnormality, single gene abnormality.
So there are really kind of two main ways that we can find out that somebody is at risk of having a child with a single gene abnormality. What are some of these ways?
So often, before we had really tests to look at a lot of single genes, and before those tests were really commercially available and financially, potentially something that people could afford, really it was just only after the birth of a child in the family that actually had the condition and oftentimes passed away early or had severe, issues related to that condition. We still see that now. I still definitely see people who have an affected child and then come to do genetic testing because they don't want to have another affected child. But now we have tests available. There's 3 or 4 different major companies right now. It's a group of tests called expanded carrier screening. And so it's a genetic test that looks, regardless of ethnicity or race, at just a bunch of different mutations, and that number is evolving all the time. Right now, the test that
it's a bunch.
Oh yeah, it's 470 now, but there's a 620. I think Carrie, you mentioned it first, but then I talked to somebody from one of those companies, and I think there's 620 panel that's going to be available really, really soon. And so it looks at things that you've heard of, that you've never heard of, that but they're all really bad, and you don't want to have a child that has 2 copies of those abnormalities because that child can be severely impacted. So by doing that test, so if you go to one of our offices, for example, as a new patient, we'll talk to you about doing that expanded carrier screening test on both you and your partner. Even if you carry something bad, as long as you don't carry the same recessive trait, the same bad trait, then you're okay. But if you both carry the same trait, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of having a baby that's impacted by that condition.
What are some of the exceptions to that rule?
So to talk about carrier screening in more detail, we cover this in episode 210. So that's a more in-depth episode. But some of the exceptions to this are autosomal dominant conditions. So when we say When we're talking about carrier screening, for the most part, we're looking at autosomal recessive, meaning it takes a bad copy from both sides of the equation, both passing down that bad copy to cause a problem. There's some conditions where it just takes one bad egg to ruin the whole bunch. And if you
Or sperm.
have that, what?
Or
I said
sperm.
one bad egg. I said or sperm.
Or sperm. That's
Yeah.
fair.
This is equally shared amongst men and women for a change, right?
Yes, it's kind of nice for that parity there.
For one time, it's not just the egg's fault.
Yeah. So if somebody carries that gene, there's a 50-50 shot that they're going to pass it down to their child, and that the child has a much higher percentage of being affected. So one of the more common things that people know about at this point is the BRCA genes, BRCA. These are the ones that highly predispose people to breast cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate, pancreatic, that whole constellation of cancers. And so when a parent carries that gene and they pass and they have children, there's a 50-50 shot for each child that child will carry the gene and then have some significantly increased risk for that particular cancer syndrome.
What about the times that it is the egg's fault? The X-linked things.
So there's some traits that are only passed from mother to son through the X chromosome. And the reason they're passed mother to son is because the son, all he can get from the mom is an X. If he's a son, he has to get the Y from the dad. So if the mom carries a certain trait, then she can pass it to her son. So those are situations where sometimes, back before we did a lot of genetic testing, sometimes we could test for gender. And in situations like that, sometimes people would even elect, if it was a mother who was affected, or carried it, would elect to transfer only female embryos, because she knew that her daughter would only be a carrier, either not a carrier or a carrier, but would not have the actual condition.
Yeah, good deal.
There are conditions like Fragile X that kind of follow this set of inheritance patterns of passing from one generation to the next. You start to add in layers of complexity depending on what you're talking about, because there are some of these X-linked conditions that they exist and they're medically relevant, but you won't necessarily change what you do because of them. There are others that are extraordinarily medically relevant, and
like multiple dystrophy.
yeah,
Right?
muscular dystrophy,
Muscular dystrophy, yeah.
and Fragile X and things like that start to get more and more complicated. So once we start to get into these discussions, really with all these genetic discussions, getting a genetic counselor involved is important. But there's a set of particularly technical ones where it is in no way optional. You really have to have a genetic counselor weigh in on some of these things, if for no other reason than to give good explanations of what it is and how it all works. Because just because you know how one genetic condition works, that just means you know how one genetic condition works. They're very much not all the same.
Well, and just to tag onto that, shout out to our genetics counselors, because I very clearly will explain the very limited knowledge I have about genes and chromosomes, and then go, you need, and then a lot of times our couples will start asking more specific questions. I'm like, that's out of my wheelhouse. You need to talk to the genetics counselor. And the nice thing about a lot of these, or all of these tests, is part of what you pay for is to speak to a genetics counselor. Now, usually it's after you find out that you have a gene, and whether you and your husband both carry the same one or not, they give you a wealth of information, talk to you about what this means for your family, what it can mean for your child if they inherited it. So I think we would all agree that we always recommend, once we give the results, you need to talk to a genetics counselor to get more information about this.
So to go a little deeper, sometimes we can have some other things that you can inherit from whoever you're getting your egg and sperm from, that you would test with something called PGT-SR. What is PGT-SR?
So SR is standing for structural rearrangements. And this is when you have the presence of all 46 chromosomes. So all the genetic material is there, but it is arranged improperly. So instead of having a nice pair where they're all joined right in the middle at that center segment, you've got a pair, but it's joined end to end instead of right smack in the middle, making that nice little X. And so when it is joined end to end like that, when it goes to separate down the middle is no longer dividing it into a 50-50 split. The middle is dividing it into some other, cockeyed distribution where you end up with a weird imbalance in the resulting child. And again, pregnancy is a highly risky thing for the mom. There's a lot of things that have to go exactly right. And so when those genes, the chromosomes and the genes on them are rearranged, there are times that that can work out where you end up with the ultimate 50-50 split that you need, but there's a disproportionately high amount of times when you will not, and the resulting embryo does not implant, does not continue on to a live birth, there's a miscarriage, those types of things. So you end up with an imbalance in there. And so when we're looking at genetic testing for this, the goal is to figure out which of the resulting embryos are fully balanced, which ones are not fully balanced, and then of the ones that are fully balanced, which ones have the right arrangement versus not.
Very good. Very good. There's a new kid on the block in the PGT world. And we're going
Me
to
to
talk
all of
about
us
a
about a
little
year ago.
bit. PGTP. What is PGTP?
So PGTP stands for polygenic traits. So polygenic traits, an example of that would be something like high blood pressure, heart disease. There's not one single gene that you can inherit that would say, oh, you're going to have heart disease. It's a whole group of genes, more than one gene. And that's really kind of outside our wheelhouse. We've all been so focused on single gene abnormalities. That's kind of what we think about now. But there are groups of geneticists and scientists who are looking to identify what are the most important genes that potentially give you a high chance of having one of these polygenic traits. And again, there's about 10 or 11 right now that you could go to a physician and say, hey, I want my embryos tested for X, Y, or Z. And so I think the challenge is right now, not everybody agrees on the genes that give you the highest chance of each of those polygenic traits. But the technology is out there and available in some platforms if that's something that you're interested in looking at.
Some of the other diseases that are included, I mean, being American, I kind of assume most of us are going to die from heart attacks and diabetes and strokes and things like that. Just because, I don't know, I feel like we all have those in our family history. But other things that are probably a little less kind of, it feels like everybody has them, things like melanoma or really bad form of skin cancer, type 1 diabetes, schizophrenia. Those are some things that all of those things can have some major life implications, and sometimes earlier in your life than later. And so these tests, and there's only a few different groups in the US currently providing PGTP type testing. It at least gives you, even though we may not know all the genes involved, it may help you if you have multiple embryos to test. You could look and be like, okay, well, it looks like this embryo is going to have less of a risk than this embryo with this polygenetic testing if I'm ideally wanting to help reduce the risk of my child of having one of those conditions. So again, this is the new kid on the block. There aren't a lot of options out there right now. When it comes to PGTA, there's quite a few options out there. But it's neat to see that within the fertility realm, this is definitely something that is growing and evolving, and something ideally we'll be talking about in a year from now, because we're going to have even more information. And kind of along that lines is the testing that we're doing with PGT, whether it's A, M, S, R, P, is it stagnant, or are we having, or do we see changes in the technology on the horizon?
There's always changes in the horizon.
And as soon as you bring in genetics, the changes are 10 times as many and 10 times as fast, because this is probably the fastest growing part of our field.
Well, and one of the most exciting things I think about our field just in general is, unlike a lot of other fields, I mean, I've been in this for more than 20 years, and now I look back and almost take like a gasp, like, I can't believe how much this field has changed since I started out. I mean, the technology is just fascinating. And I think the other plug I'll put in, I got a master's degree in translational medicine, and what translational medicine means, you take scientific bench research and you translate it into health for people and that can actually have benefit from it now. And we do this better than any other field. And that's why I still say so excited about this field, is because we are working hand in hand with basic scientists who are doing this, growing embryos in the lab and testing them genetically. And then we take those same embryos and put them back in people, and it improves their lives. I mean, it improves their chances for a healthy outcome. So I think that's what has fascinated me for years about this field, and just constantly keeps me excited, because there's always change and it's always for the better.
This is one of the fields where when you go to our national conference, and this is very different than when we talk to some of our colleagues, when you go to the national conference, there is a very, very solid mix between the clinicians, so all the physicians and nurses and everybody involved there, and the basic scientists. And it's at this point relatively unusual to be able to put a basic scientist and a physician in the room and have them speak the same language. And so, not that it's perfect by any stretch at our meetings, because a lot of them are talking about things that we have no concept of what they're doing and how they're getting there.
Which is beautiful. We're so happy that they are doing this.
We're delighted that they're doing this. We're delighted
it's a great
that they know
marriage.
what they're talking about. But it's but you can be sitting at the dinner table, and you can have somebody who only deals with patients and someone who only deals with cells, and they can be speaking relatively the same language and trading information that prompts people to do things totally differently. It's really cool.
It is very neat. It is very neat. And obviously, this is something that makes us excited about what we do and helping people and new ways we can help people. And it's exciting to think of, even in 5 years from now, what are we going to do with whatever new PGT is around the corner? So,
or new ways to make eggs and sperm in 5 to 7 years.
So on that, I think we've covered a lot of important information. To our audience, thank you so much for listening, and stay in tune for next week for more. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Would love to hear from you. We're on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Subscribe, follow us, and stay updated on all things fertility.
And don't forget, we have an IVF book coming out in about a year. So if you have any ideas for what you think we should add into our book, let us know. You can also visit us on fertilitydocsuncensored.com to submit specific questions. All questions will be answered just like they were today on our Ask the Doc segment. So leave us an episode idea or question. We'd love to hear from you.
As always, this podcast is intended for entertainment and is not a substitute for medical advice from your own physician. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.